I tapped him on the shoulder and he turned around and I said, Harvey, you need to come with me now. And in any normal circumstances, I would have, hell would have broken loose. And he took one look at me and he stood up and he walked and followed me like a lamb. And it makes me quite emotional because I knew at that moment that what Rowena had told me was absolutely true. And actually at that moment, I didn't really know what I was going to do. But actually, Jodie contacted me in July in 2017, and I was speaking to her up until October the 6th when the article went live. So it was a good period of time that I was speaking to her on a often daily, weekly basis, corroborating other people's stories, giving her other leads, talking to her about, my agreement. Because they have to be so fastidious with the details. They can't just publish anything on hearsay. And so it was a huge job for them. And in fact, it wasn't until I read the book that I really understood everything that went on. Because as a source, you don't know who the other sources are.
And you just got your kind of view.
You're in your own little, isolated chamber, and you have no idea who else they're speaking to.
And just for listeners who haven't seen the film and don't know the story, Zelda, you worked for Harvey Weinstein. That's how you're part of the story.
Yeah, I worked for Harvey from my very early 20s. It was really my first proper job. And I fell into sort of being his assistant very early on at my time in Miramax. And I worked for him for about 4.5 years. And I think one of the things, everybody's very kind and says what I did was very brave. But to be honest, I didn't think what I did was brave. I thought what I did was normal. And part of the reason that I think I was so protected in a way in that job was because I fell into it. So I didn't have this huge ambition. Working for Harvey Weinstein and Miramax wasn't on my wish list. I didn't know anything about them when I started working there. So I had this kind of invisible protection because I wasn't ambitious. But this is something I find really hard because it shows that having ambition as a woman puts you in a much more vulnerable position.
Because you could lose your position.
And that's what Harvey really preyed on a very grand scale with, obviously, actors, because for actors, he was the golden ticket and the key, not just to be in his films, but for the whole of the movie industry at that time. I don't know if it really shows in the film, and I think unless you're in the industry, you wouldn't realise. But Harvey was one of the most powerful people in the world at that time, which sounds bonkers, but he had Bill Clinton on speed dial. He was on the front of Time magazine as one of the most powerful men in the world. This was not somebody that you said no to or messed with. So for actors it was impossible, and I'm not just talking about women, for men too. And actually I think this is something that's not shown, is Harvey's behaviour towards men was almost worse.
And that scene as well with you in the restaurant telling Jodie your testimony, what is so powerful about that scene is the way you lay out the power structures and how he's abused those power structures. And you've just said to us that actually that was straight from your mouth.
Yes, yeah, that's pretty verbatim. That whole scene is verbatim my words. And I mean, I think the other very, very moving piece in the film is Lauren O'Connor's memo, which is read out. And I mean, I think she lays out that power disparity so articulately, so brilliantly. I'm a 20-something woman. My power in this relationship is 0. His is 10. And actually, I would make it 0 and 100.
And what's really interesting in the sort of arc of the film, She Said, is that the journalists are beginning to piece together this picture and this pattern of behaviour with Harvey Weinstein. Ashley Judd has spoken, the actress Rose McGowan has spoken. In fact, Ashley Judd speaks very eloquently about how she was punished by Harvey Weinstein and her career was really put on the back burner because she dared to speak out. But what the journalists are really struggling with is getting the evidence. It's a bit like a rape conviction. It's actually how does the legal team put together the evidence? And what's amazing about your interaction in that scene is that you come forward with the evidence that starts, you know, the first bit of really kind of concrete information. And you describe an incident where one of your colleagues is assaulted by Harvey Weinstein. And just tell our listeners a bit about what happened and then what happened afterwards, because you did something quite unusual. You confronted Harvey Weinstein about what had happened.
Yeah. So I had an assistant called Rowena, who I think you're speaking to. And this was, Rowena had been working for me for a month at Miramax, and she'd met Harvey once in London, and then we went to the Venice Film Festival, and it was her first evening working for Harvey on her own. And the next morning, she told me that something really terrible had happened. And she was clearly a woman in shock. She was grey, she was shaking, she was crying. She couldn't tell me exactly what had happened. And I was very mindful of not pushing too hard because she was in a state of trauma. And I was absolutely and utterly horrified and heartbroken because I felt responsibility in that moment. I felt that I had left her alone with him. But I had never had a hand laid on me because I had very, very strong boundaries with him. And I'd never got into a position of serious danger. And I genuinely had never had anybody come to me say that anything physically had happened. So when Rowena told me this, you know, for me, this was hugely shocking. And it was a criminal act. Sexual assault is a criminal act. So for me, it was totally black and white. It was binary. It was like, that's it, we're done, you know? And, you know, Rowena, again, was in shock and was very afraid of all of the repercussions of what would happen. But I kept saying, we don't have a choice. You know, he has crossed a line. We can't work for him anymore. Even if you want to, we can't. I'm not going to work for him anymore. You're not going to work for him anymore. And I was so furious and so shocked that I immediately went down to where he was having a meeting. And it was a very important meeting that I knew that if I interrupted, I'd probably have my head ripped off. And actually going down to that meeting, my only fear was that I would have to say what I was going to say in front of Martin Scorsese. Wow. Because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to not say what I was there to say. And I mean, I feel like, I know you've seen the movie, so I'm repeating myself, but I tapped him on the shoulder and he turned around and I said, Harvey, you need to come with me now. And in any normal circumstances, I would have, you know, hell would have broken loose. And he took one look at me and he stood up and he walked and followed me like a lamb. And it makes me quite emotional because I knew at that moment that what Rowena had told me was absolutely true. And actually at that moment, I didn't really know what I was going to do.
And you're getting emotional now. Did that film bring out those emotions when you watched it?
No, but because I think I had so much protection in front of me, it's very hard to see the film objectively. You know, it's not true to life, the film. The timelines, you know, they've had to make people look like they spoke up when they didn't speak up so that you can get the full narrative. You know, it's not true. It's close to fact, but it's not true. And it's very hard to see real life experience woven as a story. But also you have to let go of your ego because what's important is the messages in that film.
And when you spoke to Harvey, how did he react? And how frightened were you to actually say those words to him and confront him about what
Well,
had happened?
I was buoyed by anger. I mean, I was so angry. And I was made more angry by the fact that I could see he was lying and that he was coming up with all his best excuses. And when I asked him and said what I thought had happened, he said, I swear on the life of my wife and children. And the thing is having worked for Harvey for 4.5 years, I knew that that was his get out of jail card that he used when he was really up against it. So again, I had this awful, you know, pit of my stomach.
You just knew.
And I actually didn't know what I was going to do. But I said, you're lying to me, and if you lie to me, I'm going to screw you. excuse my language, but, you know, because that was all I could think of to say. I didn't know how
Sounds
I
pretty
was
good
going
to
to
be
Yeah,
honest. I would have probably fluffed it in
Your
moments.
Glasgow, yeah, you would.
I would have been a lot of swearing and a lot of like.
I think I probably said a word worse than that.
There might be a Glasgow kiss
Yes.
involved, basically.
Yeah, but it was essentially at that point it was bravado because I didn't know what I was going to do, and I think that's one of the things that then, for me, the real horror of this wasn't so much what had happened with Harvey. Not that I'm diminishing that in any way, but, you know, people are weak, bad things happen. It wasn't like something I'd never heard of. But for me, when I tried to find legal recourse and get justice, that for me was when the real trauma became a nightmare, because there was no legal recourse.
And what's so interesting is that you have this, and honestly, I just cannot tell you how brave you are. And I think for so many of us watching, just the absolute admiration that so many people will have, particularly women who have been in that position, and I've been in that position, many women watching will have been in that position. But you did something about it, and what is interesting from what you say is you have the courage to take it to the authorities within the organisation, and it's just block and obstacle and denial
And silence by NDAs.
silence and these NDAs, and that's the thing that your story really shines a light on, these incredibly punitive NDAs, which are effectively gagging orders, and they're buying women's silence.
Yes, buying people's silence. And that was, as I say, that was the real moment where the scales fell from my eyes, because once we started talking to lawyers, I thought justice would be served. I thought we'd go to court. I thought it would be terrifying. I knew that we might not win, but
But you thought you'd be on a path.
Yes, I thought I was on a path.
Because it was criminal.
Yes. And I thought once I told the grown-ups that I told lawyers what happened, you know, there was only one way it would go. And for me, this is why it's so important that people don't become distracted by the perpetrator. They don't become distracted by Harvey Weinstein, the ogre. Because Harvey
Can I just make one interview?
Yes.
One of the things that was really clever in the film, the actor who's playing Harvey Weinstein, you never see his face. So he is only in shot a couple of times, and it's
Just from
obviously
the back.
physically a big guy, and I thought that was really clever.
It is, and I really laud the film for doing that, because most movies, we are voyeuristically obsessed with looking at the perpetrator, at the crime. I mean, the other thing I think is really powerful is we do not see an assault.
Those scenes are the most powerful. I think the corridor scene where you can hear testimony over the top, and also with Rowena's scene where you just see the messy hotel room and just her account of what has happened to her.
That's Laura's
Laura's.
scene, actually, yeah. But I think that's amazing, because as a woman, maybe not something you've experienced quite so much, but as a woman, it's very usual for us to have to watch violent assault, violent sex scenes, violence against women. And that has an effect on you when you're watching a film. And you can't really absorb that and watch the film and, you know, process stuff. And what's great about this film is they don't show the violence. They let you think about it and feel it. But it means that you can watch the film with a clearer eye, because you're not, as a woman, protecting yourself because you've just watched some shocking rape or assault. And, you know, I think that's groundbreaking.
I think that's such a good point, because there is often a sort of kind of female sexual torture porn that goes on in a lot of stuff we see, whether it's, you know, stuff on Netflix or whether it's films. We're actually watching women being sort of raped or killed, or there's a sort of...
The whole true crime genre is basically women getting tortured.
And it's very gratuitous. It's totally gratuitous. And what's so interesting, as you say, is that the film is not all about the characteristic and the person who's Harvey Weinstein. It's about the crimes that he does, but it is about structures. It's about power, and it's about structures, and it's about how hard it is.
That's what's important, because if anything comes out of the Me Too movement, the thing that we have to understand and learn from is that this is a structural thing. This is a cultural thing. We are all culpable. We all have a responsibility to make the change. The reason Harvey behaved the way he behaved, Epstein behaved the way he behaved, Trump behaves the way he can behave, is because our culture allows it. Because we have this sort of sycophancy towards fame and power. Now, the more powerful you become, the more you should be held to account. You should be giving a good example. But culturally, it's the other way round. And that's something that we all have a responsibility to do something about. And if we don't change the structure, law is there to protect us from ourselves. And if the law doesn't protect us from ourselves, then we're really in a bad place. And that's what I discovered at that moment in 1998. Not that, a weak man did something heinous. I discovered that the law would not protect me because I was not powerful.
Yeah. Those structures of society are not designed to protect the vulnerable and women and increasingly young men are also, we hear a lot about young men being preyed on
in politics.
particularly in politics
Yeah,
in Westminster.
it's the
There's a
same.
lot of that. But also the other thing that I thought was so interesting, very, very distressing, but it's true, and we all know it's true, is the lengths to which people go to discredit the women who come forward. We hear a man saying, isn't this just a case of just young women trying to make it in the movie business? We hear, well, why didn't you report it? Did you seem distressed? And, we know those tropes exist, and they still do, but it is really stark to hear it.
They still do. And that's also the same with NDAs. People say, well, why did you take the money? Why did you sign that agreement? And the problem is that I think also when people go and see this film and they hear about these NDAs, and they'll go, oh, God, that's so shocking. And that was, 30 years ago. It's not 30 years ago. This is still happening today, every day. Because of the experience I had, I started this campaign called Can't Buy My Silence, and we are working to change legislation to make sure that NDAs cannot be used to hide abuse, discrimination, malpractice, faulty products. It does not make any sense that in our culture we have a legal tool that basically hides crime. NDAs are to look after trade secrets and IP. Currently, NDAs are treating sexual abuse, racial discrimination, gender pay disparity as a trade secret. How does that make sense?
So would you like to have a situation where if somebody, takes their employer to court, you would like any compensation paid to be decoupled from any confidentiality?
You don't have to go to court to have a settlement. If there has been damage at work, you have a right to have a payout to settle that damage. And when you go into a settlement agreement, what you are agreeing to, and this is what these agreements are for, employment dispute agreements, I think there's one being talked about at the moment in Parliament, you are settling and saying, I am not going to take this further legally. That's what you are agreeing to do. But what's happened is this has morphed into, I will never speak about this ever to my friends, my family, my therapist, my priest, my doctor, my other employers, my other colleagues, who I then cannot warn about somebody who may be being abusive. So not only do you get gagged, but you become complicit in the crime. So you then carry the guilt and responsibility for somebody's behaviour continuing, or a faulty product continuing to be used, or discrimination continuing to happen. So you get caught in this terrible sort of well of not only being gagged, and it's a basic human right to be able to own your own trauma and speak, but of having guilt and shame and complicity to something that you can see and you can't warn anybody about.
And that must be additional torture for you because you can't speak to your friends and family about it. You're not allowed by these gagging orders.
No. And I think that's very, very powerfully represented when you see Jodie going to see Rowena's husband.
I couldn't believe that happened.
And that's true.
This is where Jodie confronts the husband and tells him that his wife was abused many years ago, and he had no idea.
No. I mean, Rowena didn't speak until the book came out. She didn't tell her parents until, then. I mean, it's so powerful, the coercion and fear that is put on you. And I mean, when we were negotiating our settlement, which was an NDA, we were kept in the legal offices of Harvey's lawyers, sometimes from 5 p.m. until 5 a.m. We weren't allowed pen and paper. We weren't allowed to go to the loo unaccompanied. We were treated like criminals. So in the same way that Harvey made you feel like you were sexualizing a situation if you were upset by him appearing naked, suddenly the same thing, it's really a form of gaslighting. Suddenly we were in the lawyer's office saying this man is is a sexual assaulter. And they were making us feel like we had the problem, that we were criminal. And when we left that building, knowing that we couldn't ever speak to each other again, we knew, we felt, we believed that if we ever opened our mouths about this ever, we would be sued, which would have been true because we were breaking a contract. And we could have gone to prison and well, having, more money taken back from us. But that actually is not true.
It's all part of the sort of building the cage of fear.
Yeah.
And they're going to come after you and take the money. So with bearing all of that in mind and the intense pressure that you would have felt having signed this agreement, what compelled you to finally speak out, and what compelled you to take that meeting with the journalist and actually say, right, I'm gonna do it, and it's time?
Well, two things very clearly. I had already spoken out, and the story had been killed in 2014. When the Amber Gutierrez, which you see in the film, there's a model who is sent into Harvey with a wire from the NYPD. And I was approached by Ken Auletta, a journalist at the New Yorker, because I happened to be in New York at the time. And I spoke to him then and told him everything, because I thought Harvey had been caught. But that story was killed. The DA didn't take it forward. And at that point, I thought Harvey would never, ever be taken down. So when Jodie rang me in July 2017, I think at that point I didn't care anymore. I felt that it was more important to speak, that I'd had the fact that the law didn't help us back in 1998, that the New York Police Department and the District Attorney of New York didn't help Amber. I felt that I couldn't continue to be silenced, and I had a moral duty to speak up. And although I broke my NDA with Jodie in that article, they wouldn't and couldn't name me. They used my name, but they didn't quote me. So I didn't officially break my NDA there, and I broke it 2.5 weeks later in the FT. But the reason I did that, and I think, again, this is the whole crux of my story, when that story came out in the New York Times, I didn't feel it was going to do anything. I didn't think it was strong enough. And so I went to my lawyers from 1998 and I said, I want to see my agreement, because I wasn't allowed to hold a copy of that agreement. And I want to find out if there is anything I can do to break it, because I believe it's in the public interest for me to break it. And they pushed back on me, and they told me I couldn't show it to another lawyer because they had signed a professional undertaking not to show it to another lawyer. So I started ringing around all the big law firms in London, seeing if somebody would help me. And I was stonewalled.
Gosh.
And the moment that happened, I realised how big this problem was, and that even more, it was the system. And I have an internal email from a senior partner at a law firm in London saying to a friend of mine who worked at that law firm, do not touch this woman with a barge pole, because she is questioning the enforceability of our NDAs. Where lawyers make money, by the way, a lot of.
And there were so many kind of, what's so good in the movie as well is Harvey's spies. Everything seems to get back to him. He's got power networks in every industry.
We were being surveilled by a company called Black Cube. I mean, and I have very clear evidence of the surveillance that was going on, to me personally. And in fact, I think a newspaper published his list that they had, and, various people on there were in red, me being one of them. And I mean, this company was, there was ex-Mossad agents. I mean, they really knew what they were doing. Our phones and computers were tapped and we were being watched.
Now, I'm conscious of time. There's two other questions I'd really like to put to you. The first one is, I mean, just talking to you now, I think Gran and I are feeling quite overwhelmed. Just can't even imagine what it was like for you to burden all of that, shoulder all of that by yourself. What toll did it take on you on a human level?
Well, I had to leave the country, so I had to leave my friends and family and career. I moved to Guatemala and worked there for 5 years because I couldn't speak. And actually, you don't realise what that means until it's too late. You don't understand the impact that has. I couldn't explain to any of my friends why I wasn't working at the apparently best job in London.
And
the real impact of what had happened took a long time to manifest. And in many ways, I haven't really and didn't really face up to the enormous damage that it did to my life until I started speaking about it in 2017. And, you know, I'm a pretty matter-of-fact person, and not, you know, this whole finding your voice thing is not how I generally talk. But I had lived the experience of not having my voice, but I had not acknowledged it. And once I started speaking, the transformation to my life was huge, but also the realization of all the loss, because I had not been able to look at what I had lost. And I think that's why it's so important to me that, you know, the campaign that I'm working on does change legislation, because these issues are still happening every day. I have women coming to me every day, and men, who are being discriminated at work and who are being silenced. And the weight of what happens when you have your voice taken away is sort of beyond belief. The majority of people's mental health, intimate relationships, and ability to work falls apart.
I mean, your life falls apart, you know, and we're so defined by what we do, and people want to have a rich and fulfilling career, and it's bound up with our identity. And when that is, everything is taken away, it's a huge...
And that happened to me when I was very young. A lot of the people who come to me are people who are much higher up. So they've got much more to lose. They have big mortgages. They have school fees. They have hundreds of dependents. You know, I didn't have any of that. And actually, in a funny way, that's what made it easier for me to speak up in 2017. You know, I don't have very much living family. I don't have children. I didn't have anybody who, if I had ended up going to jail, which at the time I genuinely thought might happen, I felt that I had that ability to do that. I was, you know, who else was I going to hurt?
What doesn't that tell us so much that you felt that, and it's hard to tell me, only you can answer this question, if all of this that happening to you so young maybe is why you've, you know, have felt, you know, you haven't had children or whatever. I don't mean that's a whole other conversation. But for you to say,
they smell.
They're quite expensive as well.
They're really expensive.
They're cost units, let's be honest.
I mean, I love other people.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to say that, you know, you felt that your ability to step forward is because you didn't have those things, and it really just, you know, shines a light on, as you say, people have so much to lose. And I suppose the final question, Grant may have another final question he wants to put to you is, you know, we've had this incredible reckoning through brave women like yourselves, the Me Too movement, women speaking out. It does feel that we're beginning to have these conversations about it. Time's up, you know, Me Too. But what do you think has really changed?
Ultimately, the conversation. Black and white change, legislative change, cultural change takes a really long time. But the first step is the conversation. And that's really important. And actually, you know, I often am quite pessimistic about the amount that has changed. But if you look at the landscape in terms of conversation now, as to 5 years ago, it's a totally different landscape. It doesn't mean that workplaces are all safe. It doesn't mean that everybody speaks up. It doesn't mean that transparency is there, but it's coming. And that's why it's so important, I think, that groups like Time's Up and Can't Buy My Silence are supported, because that's where the change is being pushed. You know, the system is not moving. Nothing has changed in British legislation since I spoke up. And when I gave evidence at 2 select committees, Theresa May's government was very behind this. We had a leadership change. We went
another one.
And another one. And another one.
And another one.
But for the first one, all of a sudden we had a cabinet who it was not in their interest to follow up something about NDAs. We know that government has had a lot of historical problems and present problems with behaviour, bullying, sexual harassment, you know, within the walls of Westminster. So it's something that hasn't moved. And actually it's quite shaming, because the laws are changing all over the world. 16 states in America, and now it's through, Biden has just signed a bill which has gone through Congress to stop NDAs being used around sexual harassment in the workplace. And we have a bill that's gone through in Canada and is about to go through in Ireland. So it's changing everywhere, but we're still sitting still. So all of the things that you see in that film can still happen, but the difference is the conversation.
And men are part of that conversation as well.
Men are absolutely part of that conversation. And, I hate to gender this, but obviously statistically women are in a more vulnerable position for abuse at work. But this happens to men too. And it's really important that men are part of this conversation, and men are the ones who help lead the change. It's just as important a male colleague at work calls out another man maybe using the wrong sort of language. Doesn't mean he has to be reported to HR, but I can tell you, if you humiliate a colleague in front of other people, he's not going to do that again. That's a small change, but it's a seismic change.